And Cory is now, he's an attorney. He's also head of Generation Capital. So I'm gonna turn it over to those two to talk about the possibility of emerging managers program in Wisconsin and find out a little bit about what maybe we could do to help. So welcome. And I think I'm going to guess maybe Jason's going to kick it off. Let's see.
Yep. Can you all hear me?
Yes. Hi, Jason.
Hey, Tom. Hey, everybody. Thank you. I see my dear friend, the secretary, my big brother, Cory, is on. So I want to thank you all, Tom. I'll just give you a brief, quick view how this will go. Cory will open up and talk about just basically some of the things that he's been doing. He's been a champion for this as long as I can remember. And he's really become the blueprint for how you, I think, do these types of things in the state of Wisconsin. I'll go over our slide. We'll take questions as well, and then we'll wrap up and conclude.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Jason.
Well, great. Well, thanks so much, Tom, for your warm introduction. It's great to see you again. It's been way too long since I catch up with you, and really appreciate the opportunity to talk to your board. I remember fondly my days connected to the Technology Council back when I was Governor Jim Doyle's first Commerce Secretary, and I really admired the work you guys were doing then, and certainly since then. So it's really my honor and my pleasure to be here. You know, Tom, you alluded to Act 255, which I look back fondly as one of my greatest accomplishments as secretary. If I had to say one of my greatest failures as Commerce Secretary was my inability, working with then Secretary Lori Keating-Heineman, to get an emerging manager program started. I don't know if you remember, but Lori led and I worked on, and Raymond Winston and others in the Doyle administration, an effort very similar to what we're talking about today. And that's the of a fund-to-funds program. We brought in fund-to-funds managers from across the country, particularly out of New York. Credit Suisse in particular had leaned in, but we couldn't get the program to be successful. And now, you know, approaching 20 years after the fact, you know, certainly 15 years after the fact, the need is as great today, I would argue, if not greater than it was back then. So I appreciate you all's interest in this. Jason really has taken the labor and oar on pushing this forward in the context of today's conversations. But I've continued to be an advocate for doing an emerging manager program in several other forms. And quite frankly, pre-pandemic was very far along in conversations with Governor Evers' administration about trying to restart some of these ideas. And then the pandemic hit, and they're like so many other places, it was just pencils down. You know, Wisconsin has a history of having done this. We didn't call it an emerging manager program, but if you go back, you know, 30 years, and you think about the launch of Mason, what we today know as Mason Wells, and what we today know as R.W. Baird's private equity businesses, both of which have grown into multi-billion-dollar businesses. They really started as emerging manager initiatives or emerging manager funds that were seeded and supported very heavily by people like SWIB, for example. And former SWIB director Bob Zobel really had started supporting those managers. John Burns, who many of you know or know of, when he was spun out of M&I Bank. So we have some history as a state in having done this. We unfortunately have drifted away from it, and beyond Mason Wells and Baird, we've not invested as much in fund formation for emerging managers as we should have been. And I think the need today is great. You know, certainly in my time post-commerce, one of the things I did was to launch a private equity fund based in Milwaukee. Our investors are banks, insurance companies, corporations, and foundations. We are now managing our third fund. We've raised more than $100 million in capital from that investor group. And, you know, we bought 30, 40 companies, 35, 40 companies in that intervening time. You know, it's hand-to-hand combat in this space, especially over the last several months. But, you know, I think about managers like me, like Jason, people all up and down the capital continuum from seed and early stage angel all the way to buyout, which is where I am. I think there's an opportunity to continue to invest in this space and to grow it. All the data shows that Wisconsin, the Midwest in general, and Wisconsin in particular, is a flyover as it relates to fund formation. So I really think that we need to fix that capital gap that exists in our marketplace. And then the last thing I'd say is, not only do we have a history of doing this, but as Jason will demonstrate, all across the country, these emerging manager or minority manager programs, and those are different initiatives, though they overlap. These emerging manager programs exist all across the country, from New York to Illinois to Florida to Texas to California. So it's a well-proven strategy, and those states are really benefited by having capital formation happen there to support the growth and the scale and the transition of businesses in their community. So I appreciate the opportunity to chat about this and to be an advocate for this. I hope that we can entice you to join us in advocating for this work. And I'd be happy to answer any questions in terms of my work as a former policymaker or the things that I've done since then as a principal of a private equity firm. So I'll stop there, Jason, and pass the ball to you.
All right, thank you. If we can go to the next slide. As Cory stated, guys, ladies and gentlemen, there's a difference, and I think the first thing we need to do, and Cory teed it up, is really just what is a diverse emerging managers program. And the reality is that there are two sort of distinct things. They can be the same thing, but they're not always necessarily tied together. When we talk about an emerging manager, we're usually talking about someone who has assets under management of, let's say, maybe $1 billion. That's usually the average. Some emerging manager programs will start at $6 billion. You have to have up to $6 billion. But for this conversation, an emerging manager is differentiated between a diverse manager. Emerging manager refers to basically assets under management where you sit under the $1 billion mark. Whereas when we use diverse manager or minority manager, we're typically talking about someone who's a person of color or a woman-owned firm. Now, if you look, the reality is that given these two distinctions, a diverse manager is not necessarily an emerging manager, and an emerging manager is not necessarily defined by race, gender, or any other characteristic. And so it's important that we distinguish between the two, because in the state of Wisconsin, you can have both. You can have an emerging and diverse manager that can occupy the same space. So next slide, please. So when we talked about this, what we wanted to look at, and again, from Cory going from a policymaker to an actual fund manager, is the reasons as to why we should look at an emerging managers program here in Wisconsin. Number one, we talk about access to capital being one of the most important reasons, particularly under the times that we're living in now. And let me just say, Tom and Steve, thank you for reaching out to me and saying, Jason, we want to be helpful. We want to come up with solutions and policies that can help us navigate all during these times of chaos. And so when we talk about the Wisconsin Emerging Manager Program, we're looking at the angle of what would it do to provide access to capital for entrepreneurs. And when we're talking about entrepreneurs specifically under this context, we're talking about diverse and emerging women, minorities, people of color, etc. If you look at that top chart where you see that majority of, in this instance, capital is allocated to our white male counterparts with roughly, I just want to move this out, 77% of capital going to that target demographic. Long story short, if you begin to move down that first top chart, you see that when it comes to African Americans, people of color, maybe we're at, if you combine all of those, 20, 25% maybe. And so when you look at that, there's a discrepancy between access to capital and programs that can help entrepreneurs, particularly in the early seed stage capital. One of the things that I want to point out in basically is that when we do most of our research and when we look at the process or the pathway, most individuals start off with money from family and friends. Well, unfortunately, that's not always the go-to option for under-targeted or underrepresented groups. Let's look at the second chart. And again, we're talking about venture capital, private equity, around the same numbers. When you look at the dollars that are generated as far as deals, you look and see that women, whether they're one female founder or all female founders, when you look at the discrepancy, you can see just how out of touch we are when it comes to allocation of capital, when it comes to deals sourced to women, people of color. And so not our proposal, but our thinking on this is to advocate for such a program so that we can begin to fill that gap. Because right now there's a huge discrepancy between those gaps of people of color, women, versus our white male counterparts who typically receive 80% of the funding. Cory, jump in at any time. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I wanted to show you, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I do think it's valid under this discussion, particularly when we face biases around why we don't see the allocation of capital going to women, people of color, minorities. There's oftentimes a bias that says these groups don't perform as well. And so when we talk about an emerging managers program, one of the things that we want to hit on is the fact that when you look at emerging managers, diverse managers, newer firms, regardless of the asset class, and here on this slide, you can see public equity, you can see private equity, you can see fixed income, and you can also see hedge funds. The reality has been that the smaller firms, because they are more nimble, they have a much better, I want to say, advantage of dealing with market inefficiencies, which I would love Cory to touch on after this slide. When you look at these, you can see that smaller firms have outperformed some of the larger asset managers, whether it's by 72 basis points in public equity. If you look under private equity, you can see the median net internal rate of return, 15.2% against all US private equity firms at 3.7. If you move over to fixed income onto the right side of the slide, you can see younger firms outperform older firms in core fixed income, 7.7 rate, whereas 6 to 10-year-old firms are 6.6, and all the way down to hedge funds, where you're looking at smaller firms often outperform larger firms, older, more established firms by 220 basis points. And so with that said, Cory, I want you to, if you can, touch on, because you made a great point when we talked about market inefficiencies. And I think that goes underrated when we talk about emerging managers and why it's beneficial. So if you could touch on that for me.
Yeah, so in the bottom left-hand corner where it shows private equity, that's the world that I live in. And certainly my experience and my track record tracks what's shown in the NAIC firms versus all US private equity. And there's been countless studies that have been done over the last 20 years that show that emerging managers, minority managers, and women managers outperform their counterparts. There's a lot of different theories for why that's so, ranging from what I'll call social factors of being a startup firm, hungrier, having not yet created your wealth and more motivated to do that, a little less, call it fat and happy. So there's a lot more hustle and a lot more hunger. There's that as a set of factors. But also, these folks are, by definition, by demographic definition, they are exploiting inefficiencies based upon their social relationships that other people aren't exploiting. They're swimming in a different pool. We're sourcing deals from different people. We have different networks and different relationships. And those inefficiencies help us create alpha, whether it's buying companies at lower values or identifying niche opportunities in markets that are overlooked. I think there are a combination of factors that coalesce that lead to outperformance as we're exploiting those market inefficiencies. I know that in my segment of the market, given the kinds of deals that we do in the upper Midwest, we're typically in non-competitive processes where we're involved in very relationship-driven transactions, and where our purchase multiples might be 4 to 5 times EBITDA. They used to be 4 to 5, they're now more to 5 to 6. Whereas other firms are going to be 7, 8, or 9 times, and they're going to be operating in auction processes Those kinds of inefficiencies really allow us to create the kind of outperformance that you see represented in the NAIC firms versus all U.S. private equity. So I think for combinations of reasons that go to our operating model, our relationships, where we are in our wealth creation continuum, you see managers that are more motivated and have typically been more successful in creating alpha compared to their non-diverse peers.
Thank you, Cory. We can go to the next slide. So one of the things I wanted to do, and again, at the the suggestion, the encouragement of Cory, was to put together a group of states, financial firms, businesses that have these emerging manager programs. And as Cory mentioned to you all before, this is across the country, from the West Coast to the East Coast to the Midwest down South, where you see these emerging manager programs. And I just want to take a minute to highlight a few so that you all can see that this has been done, it's being done, and people are having great success. When we look at CalPERS, which is the first logo on the slide, you're looking at the California Public Employees Retirement System, where they've allocated $8.2 billion to emerging managers. And next, you look at the Teacher Retirement System of Texas. Kirk Sims, who is an African-American gentleman who moved from the Teacher Retirement System in Illinois to Texas to head up their emerging manager program. He's doing a phenomenal job. In fact, the teachers just allocated more capital to that program. And they have a fund of funds sort of model as well, where they're advocating, they have roughly $5.7 billion with 169 managers. And when you look at what Texas did, they have a combination of emerging and diverse manager programs. So most of these programs that you see on your slide will have some combination of an emerging and diverse fund of funds model set up. Our neighbor next door, Illinois, the Illinois retirement system, teachers retirement system, $750 million allocation to 18 firms that currently manage $500.6 million. The state treasurer in Illinois, who just launched, I want to say maybe a couple of years ago, the Illinois Growth and Innovation Fund, where they're looking at $220 million over a 3-year period to allocate to 15 to 20 different funds. And what they said was that would generate maybe directly 18,000 jobs across Illinois. And so again, when you see these things being done, there are great benefit to these things being done as far as the creation of jobs, dealing with market inefficiencies, things of that nature. The state of New York and the city of New York, which is the next logo over, they both have an emerging managers program. And what I like about what they're doing is they have, many of these programs have a almost graduated mentor type model where you can advance from an emerging manager to large, being able to go have direct investments of larger pieces of the pot. So what they try to do is make sure that they're building up their new managers, they're working in conjunction with their emerging managers, their diverse managers, and making sure that there's a collaboration so that everyone is successful. Last thing I want to look at here on that slide is Allstate. And I wanted to give you all examples of Allstate, Morgan Stanley, Credit Suisse, Prudential. They also have emerging manager programs. And here what we see with the financial firms who have these programs, they really do what we call a graduation type model. Fund of funds, but yet it's a graduation model so that you're being successful, they're going to help you continue to grow. And because of that collaboration, because of that help, because of that mentorship, you're going to see these firms become more successful over the years. Allstate, for example, allocated $900 million. I want to say their program came out not too long ago. Next slide. So here is what, in my mind, I think, just to make this simple, what you would look at as a setup for a Wisconsin Emerging Managers Program. A fund of funds model, as Cory mentioned, what I did was use the emerging minority, people of color individuals in this space, again, with Generation Growth Capital, Cory being the one that's more mature, more longer track record, again, advocate from the policy and of the management side. A fund-to-fund models would look at that with WEMP in the middle. That would be the fund-to-funds manager. And people like myself and Cory and other individuals at some time would more than likely apply to be a member of those fund-to-funds models. Cory, is that what we were?
Yeah, I mean, that's been the traditional model in the fund-to-fund space, is that you find, you know, a Credit Suisse or a Neuberger Berman or somebody like that, who you make they create a fund of 100 million, 250 million, whatever is the appropriate scale. And then they look at market rate investment opportunities across asset classes to deploy that capital. That's generally what folks have done as the most efficient way to deploy capital, as opposed to having you know, someone else try to make those direct investments. The fund-to-fund model is the prevailing model, though certainly not the only one.
Okay. Next slide. And so here's one of the things, and Tom, you, Steve, and I, we've talked about this with some of the creation of some of the funds and some of the things here in Wisconsin. Some of the challenges that are facing emerging and diverse manager programs is the restriction to narrowly have the managers narrowed to a certain geographic area. For example, if we do a fund-to-fund managers and say, well, you can only invest in Wisconsin-based companies. That has been sort of a limit, or I want to say it's been a restriction, which I think reduces your chances of reaching higher alpha, because again, you're limiting the supply of what a manager can look for when you limit it to regions. And I think we've been down that model before. So when we look at the challenges now to creating an emerging and diverse manager program, that's probably one restriction where we would be mindful of, that we don't limit the potential creation of this one by saying you can only invest, or we can only deal with Wisconsin-based startups, for example. The next point is restriction guidelines, where the person would not be able to flexibly make changes and adapt to the program. So these things have been in addition to some of the biases, these have been typically the major challenges for emerging and diverse managers. Geographic limitations, institutions hindered by restrictive guidelines put on the potential managers. These are things that we should be leery of if we're going to go down this road. If Wisconsin Technology Council is going to advocate for this, you guys done this before, and I think you're very aware of some of those pitfalls. Next slide.
Very much.
The objective of an emerging managers program, and here's where we talk about, if we're going down this road where we're building a coalition of individuals advocating for this, then the objectives for this program has to be to generate the appropriate risk-adjusted investment returns, whether that's from early stage funds, all the way to pre-seed early stage funds, all the way up to the buyout phase where Cory is at. If we're going to make sure that we create this ecosystem, then it should be a full-fledged ecosystem based on generating risk-adjusted returns, identifying early-stage funds, and their potential for success. Number two, access unique investment opportunities. Cory mentioned it when we talked about this is a relationship, manager information, networks that you may have some access to that typically we in Wisconsin may not. To give you an example of that, I know, for example, I did some small investing in a company that will be going public called Black Mama Tea and Vodka. She's been on TV across the country. In fact, I think one of her backers was Mr. Wonderful from Shark Tank, Kevin O'Leary. He made a video for her. I had her on my radio because I wanted more individuals to get in and look at her company and support her. And she and I have been talking back and forth. And so here is what Cory mentioned when we talk about relationships. And here's an African-American woman, very well regarded, credible, but yet in a place like Wisconsin, if you didn't know she existed, you miss out on those types of opportunities. Number 3, bullet point 3, and this is where the graduation, the mentorship type model comes in. Cultivate the next generation of external portfolio management talent. Case in point, you have a Cory Nettles in adjacent fields. I would be remiss if I didn't get some knowledge or some mentorship from Cory, because he's been down this process. He's been through a lot of things that can help myself and some of the other emerging managers that was in this slide. And number 4, bullet point 4, again, we come back to why we need such a program, is to provide access to capital for undeserved communities. Statistics will show there is a large discrepancy when we talk about access to capital. Last slide. The benefits of Emerging Managers Program, again, this is when we talk about the market inefficiencies. Emerging managers' small size may allow them to be much more nimble, enabling them to respond to more efficiently to market changes. Number 2, emerging funds may be able to tap into market niches, which could allow them to exploit market inefficiencies. So again, when we talk about the Emerging Managers Program, we're talking about it from an A to Z perspective, so that it's not just the right thing to do, but this makes business sense as well. And what I call, we're leaving money on the table when we have those market inefficiencies far too often. And I believe this is the last slide coming up. And finally, guys, here is a list of all the people that I've talked to so far that have indicated, and Cory's talked with these guys, these ladies and gentlemen, that indicated a support of the Department of Administration. I know both Cory and I both spoke with the governor's office, Joel Brennan, Maggie Gow, the state treasurer, Tom and Steve. You guys know Sarah Godlewski. She's very pertinent about these kinds of programs. The Wisconsin Bankers Association, a good friends of ours. In fact, I'm talking with Mike Simmons today, later today, about this. He and I have been going back and forth. I was called by the city treasurer of Milwaukee, Spencer Cox, to discuss a potential emerging managers program, what that would look like. Startup Milwaukee, Matt Cordo, again, good guy, more grassroots organizing type of guy, supporter. Tom, between you and Bram, you gave me a suggestion to talk with Kathy from NKE Tech. We did, it went well. She likes the idea of this. And so when you look at this, we're just looking at building a coalition of individuals. And the goal is really to have Wisconsin Technology Council help advocate for such an initiative as well. And so when you look there, again, this is being the final slide, supporters and allies across the gamut, and that list of supporters and allies are growing.
Very good.
Can I just make one last point, that, or at least amplify something that's kind of underlying, some of these slides, is where does the money come from? And, I've alluded to this earlier. I know that Jason has alluded to this as well. And I think there's a range of potential sources of capital to support such a fund, whether it's the state through GPR, whether it's people like SWIB, and it's been a thorn in my craw that SWIB has not stepped up and supported this kind of capital formation today as they did, a generation or so ago. I'd be happy to talk more about that. I'm actively banging on some of my friends on the SWIB board about having SWIB step up in the way that Illinois teachers or New York teachers or fire and police pension funds across the country have done. SWIB needs to be brought to the table. As Jason said, there's city and county treasurers, there's banks and insurance companies. Many of Northwestern Mutual has been the largest investor in each one of my funds, thankfully. But you've also got people like American Family out there. BMO has been the largest bank investor in each one of my funds. So there's no shortage of capital, but I think if we can build a broad enough coalition, we can go to these capital providers and encourage them to do something that is good policy for the state and provides a good return for them. Just to be really clear, what we're talking about is a market rate of return on capital across asset classes. This is not charity, this is not philanthropy. This is us coming together to support capital formation in Wisconsin. hopefully businesses in Wisconsin and providing a market rate of return on capital to those investors. And I'll stop there, Tom. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Cory and Jason. You know, a couple of thoughts here, and I want to open it up for more. I mean, Jason, I noticed my friend Eric Borgening piped in and said, we're going to miss you in the legislature, and I totally agree.
I'm not going too far, Tom. I'm not going too far.
Well, that's true. That is very true. And I think your ability to reach across the aisle and within your own caucus has been really amazing, and has helped a lot in expanding and refining some things around Act 255. But beyond that as well. And so thanks for working with us. And Steve Lyons, who you mentioned, has been a great advocate. Your point about not confining this to the state is an important one. I think we've seen some things that have maybe not gone as well as they could with efforts that have been around confining to the state. If you do that, it's automatically limiting. If you're broader, the state stands to benefit even more, I think, in terms of the amount of capital and expertise and everything else that's attracted. So on this, I mean, you know, I think our board has just generally supported these kinds of efforts over time through our white papers. In fact, at one point we had a bit of a placeholder. Maybe we were channeling our inner Cory Nettles or something, but we had something about an emerging managers program in the past, and so it's not unprecedented at all. And I could see us, with the board's permission, trying to make sure that the governors and his administration understand this. I mean, we have really good contacts there, as well as the legislature itself, because that will change again in the fall, and you know, it can be, as you well know, Jason, a different set of characters. So, you know, I'd love to hear from some of the others there, but I think it's one of those things where the timing appears to be right, and also the kind of coalition that can be put together seems to be effective. So, other thoughts on anything? I see John Nice said this is so important on so many levels. John, if you're able to pipe in a little bit.
Sure. Well, a couple things here. First of all, I've talked with several large institutional investors about their emerging manager programs, and one of the things they stress is that you know, there are some large communities that are largely ignored that are you know, they spend a lot, and you know, investors do best focusing on industries they know and communities they know. And if you're not from the community, if you're not in those sectors, there are opportunities that, you know, you'll never see and never understand. And so we're just ignoring communities that we don't understand. So that is a big driver in the overall rate of return that they expect from these, that, you know, people within the community see the things in their backyard. But I think equally important, given the national conversation we're having right now about some of the inequities and the opportunities to try to lift communities, the time is right for this. The lack of access to capital for entrepreneurs in big sectors of our economy is stifling, and we shouldn't have such an unequal. You know, we think this is the land of opportunity for everybody, but it's tremendous opportunity for many, and a long shot at opportunity for many others. And we just really need to level that playing field. And this is a great way to open up the doors to many potential entrepreneurs across the state.
Okay, that's very well said. Thank you, John. Chairman Lynch, are you able to get on here?
Yep, I'm here.
Hi, Greg. I don't know what you feel would be appropriate at this point, but perhaps we could circulate something to the board that intended to be supportive of this general approach, and see if we can, move from there in terms of a board action, or perhaps you want to have something of an informal or formal vote now. But
yeah, I think either one is certainly, I think there's a consensus among the board and the members I talked to about supporting this initiative. And I want to offer up to Jason and Cory to reach out to individual members of the board to help with this, to make introductions and contacts, because I think we can be a resource to help, you've raised the funds for this and develop the coalition to make this happen. Because I think, as Cory knows, going back from his days at Commerce, the Tech Council has always been a supporter of, expanding the pool of investment capital in the state. And I think this is a much needed initiative for the reasons that John and others stated.
Very good. Okay. Well, thank you both for joining in today, and we'll be back in touch on many different things, and really appreciate your efforts on this.
Hey,
Thank you, guys. Appreciate this on.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, thanks for your time.
Thanks, guys.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, that's great. Two good presentations today around what's happening in the investment climate in Wisconsin, and different presentations to be sure, but both excellent and both part of what's needed. I'd like to turn now. I mean, we also heard, of course, from Ann Zink earlier about what's going on with the virus in Wisconsin and some of the trends there. One of the pieces I think would be important now is to hear from our next group of panelists about what's going to happen in higher education this fall. Earlier, Clean Care talked about, some of the things with his school here in Madison, and those are complicated enough when you're talking about an elementary and preschool setting. But higher education is yet another animal. So now I think we want to turn it over to Chancellor Jim Schmidt from UW-Eau Claire, which I think is a very representative campus of the UW system overall. Rolf Waginke, who's president of the Wisconsin Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, and as such represents about 26, I think it is, of those private colleges. And Jim Zylstra, who's vice president at the Wisconsin Technical College System, and can talk about what's happening in that, the 16 districts, and I think it's 47 different campuses. So they're all different, but in a way they're all the same because they're all higher education. And so perhaps we can, I don't know who's going to lead that off, but I think maybe Jim Schmidt, or maybe it's Rolf. We'll see.
I don't think we compared notes, but I could jump in.
Okay. Hello, Chancellor Jim.
Yeah, thank you for having us on today. The COVID has created an unusual circumstance because universities really exist to create collisions of people and ideas and beliefs and frameworks. And really at the heart of what we do, particularly as a campus, it really focuses on high impact experiences, a highly residential setting, really known for the undergraduate in-person instruction.